Since morning, we heard about the bushland, the industrial cities, we heard about the reservoirs and the hill terrains, and then many more things from different speakers. Now, this is a story. I mean, all these stories have one common factor that I can see. All of them actually talk about one thing, that's called that decommunization is not a one-off event. It's a process. It's a process that that takes time, and over the years, we cannot just suggest that this is a time at that point the decommunization has happened. But then there could be certain moments when regimes change. That's why in the morning I was just mentioning to one of our presenters that is it not the correct word? I mean, she used the term regime. So is it not the correct word to use a common or commonization regime for certain changes that take place? So this story that I am talking about today is about a riverine landscape. And my story revolves around three major issues. It moves from here to here. No, right. So one of the first issues that we talk about here is the historical factor that shaped the development of new urban settings. So when we talk of decommunization, we will see that there are various historical factors at work that that force the regimes to take measures in certain way to develop urban centers like these. And these urban centers actually take shape in vulnerable areas. The second issue that we take up is that when such urbanization takes place, these have environmental consequences, long-term environmental consequences, and these environmental consequences are of because of these politically driven urbanization process that takes place. So we have different political and economic factors at work that drive these urbanizations, and then these have long-term ecological consequences. And the third thing that we actually talk about are the analysis of the decommunization process, which gives an insight into the dynamics of the excludability and the subtractability that Prateek just mentioned in the morning. This paper overall, if you will see that my paper overall argues that instead of seeing the ecological crisis that earlier scholars like Gerd Hardin and others have talked about, that common is actually, or the exploitation of the common leads to tragedy of different types. Now, I think it should be recognized as a crisis which is rooted in the politics and the governance which leads to the decommunization. And to a large extent, it is shaped and influenced by various legal and administrative policies. In fact, in a paper published earlier, very recently, I explained about an ephemeral landscape, ephemeral common landscape, which was actually decommunized gradually. Ephemeral landscape is a landscape which would emerge out of the rivers. And in the Gangetic Basin, it is known as the Diara lands. In the eastern part of India, it is known as the Chor lands. These are newly emerged lands. But then what we see is that these lands were, were part of the common properties. Nobody was the owner of these landscapes. But the British government then in the 19th century realized that these new emerging landscape coming out of the rivers because of the the changing courses of the river, this could be useful for their own revenue. So they came up with an ADR. It's called the Alluvium and Diluvium Regulation Act in 1825. They wanted to take control of those landscapes. And then, the people who were settling those newly emerged landscapes, many of them being, fishermen. So they were dependent on such landscape. So I talk about various ecological consequences about this decommunization process in that paper. So building on the same hypothesis, I now, then in this story, I examine the historical evolution of the urban spaces in colonial India with a particular focus on the city of Patna, which is located quite close to the Ganges, which is this. This is Ganges River coming right from the Himalayas, upper Himalayas, and then you have many rivers meeting the Ganges in this part of eastern India, and there are many rivers coming from the Deccan also meeting the Ganges. Now, this entire landscape that you see where the urban center actually emerged and developed was a fluvial landscape. It was a landscape which was, we have various paleochannel mapping that has been done by scientists, which show that this was these are all old channels of different rivers in those areas. So, the area is then this entire study area is having three rivers around it. There is a Ganges flowing in the north, and then you have two rivers meeting the Ganges. One is known as the Punpun River, and other is known as the Stone River. Now, these are the three rivers which surround this entire city. Now, one of the, this is Patna is one of the oldest city. I mean, it has been in existence for many centuries, and one of the strongest and the largest, empire of India was actually had its capital here in this part that was known as Patliputra. So the city was earlier, the ancient name of the city was Patliputra. And this was an area from where, the modern rulers, the Magadhan rulers, controlled the entire India. Now, but this, the old city, the old traditional city is located on the eastern side. And the major portion that you see, which is the green area, is actually the new settlement of 19th and the 20th century. Now, traditionally, the older city was the area where people lived, and this was the area belonging to everyone. It was a common property. Nobody would settle there, and it belonged to everyone because it was a floodplain area. Now, when the British came in the 18th century, they occupied this territory. They got this area also for their Diwani rights. Initially, they settled their factories here. So if you look at this strategic location of this area, this is the Ganges along which the British were finding themselves very comfortable for trading activity. So they passed through these rivers, and they were connected to the hinterland also. They will bring various products from different areas, and they would all settle all the factories just close to the rivers. Now, this is a map, this is a painting that you see is a painting from 1825. And this is an opium factory, which is located quite close to the Ganges, and it is on a higher elevation. But the second photograph that you see is a modern city where you have lot of settlements that have grown up, and at the north is the this river. Right at the top that you see is this river. So there has been a huge settlement that has taken place over the last 2 centuries. Now, why it has happened that the British now have to build this new city? So they wanted to settle here because this was an area where you have a lot of factories. Before the British East India Company, you have the Dutch East India Company also having their factory of saltpeter on the same bank. That building still exists, and you have many, it's a 17th century building. Now, this is an older settlement. This is a map which was drawn by Francis Buchanan in 1811 and 12. This is an old settlement, old area, and these are all the new British settlements on the left. Now, there were two events which have forced the British government to actually move to this part of the city. Now, there was one event in 1763, and there was, a massacre of many of the British officers, British East India Company officers, by the local rulers. Now, this massacre had created an anxiety among the British that if they remained close to the old city, they could be in trouble. So they wanted to remain away from the older city. Now, it was then decided that before that, they had already developed a cantonment in Dinapur. This is Dinapur, right at the top, which is on a higher elevation. Now, they decided that if they develop a city, a settlement, which is away from the old city and close to the cantonment, this could be a safer place. Because if there is any attack from the local people, they will have a backup coming immediately to save them from the cantonment right at the top. Now, this kind of a event of massacre or killing on large scale had taken place earlier also in Calcutta, which is famously known as the Black Hole tragedy. Now, in 1857, there was a massive revolt against the British. There were revolts in different parts of North India and Eastern India. This was one event when there was a change in the policy of the government. Now they realize that it is important for them to mix up with the local population. So, what they have done in various cities is that they have set up military and administrative quarters inside the older city. For example, take the example of Delhi, take the example of Lucknow. So they have settled, they have created military and civil lines and police stations right in the old city. And they realize that if, because of this, the failure of the information that the 1857 revolt has taken place, so it is important that they live within that old city. But in this city, the policy has not changed. Even the 1857 revolt has not forced them to change and switch to the older city. So even after 1857, this is an 1885 map. What you see is that most of them have settled on the western side. Now, this is a map of the paleo channels, and the darker line of the river that you see is the main river course. but these are all paleochannels where the settlement has taken place in the 19th and the 20th century. So all those dotted lines are the paleochannels. Now, this paleochannel mapping shows that this was a vulnerable area. This was not an area for permanent settlement or a built environment. This is another map which shows you the surface topographical variation, and the old settlement is basically on a higher elevation. This is a higher elevated area, which is traditionally a settled area, but the area that you find on the west is on a lower elevation. Now, this is another map of 1811 and 12 drawn by Francis Buchanan, and this shows how new settlements have expanded towards the west. Now, when the new settlements were created along the banks of the Ganges and then towards the south, what they have done is that in order to protect those newer settlements, they created embankments along the Ganges. But what would happen to the settlements which are located on the south of the Ganges? Now, on the southern side, they have two major rivers which are flooded annually. This is Son and Punpun. Now, in order to protect that area, lowland area, from flooding, they create a railway line, an Eastern Indian Railway, which was coming from Calcutta. So they draw a parallel line, railway line, which would protect the lowland area, and then it will create a kind of a buffer zone. So, you have two embankments. One is the Walden embankment on the northern side, which is protecting the city from the Ganges, and then you have a long railway line which is protecting the city from Son and Punpun rivers. Now, if we talk about the long-term impact effects of this decommonization process, because now the common property which was livable, which was used by everyone, it has become decommunized, and it is an area where only the British could live. People were not supposed to enter into that area. Now, this has actually restricted the people movement in those locations. But then, this what we see is that it has increased the excludability. It has increased the excludability, but the subtractability factor has not come in. Now, and that's one of the issues that we discussed in the initials, in the first section, that whether this excludability and subtractability factor come together when a decommunization process happens. Now, it is not necessary, because in this case, what we have seen is that the excludability factor has although come in, but the subtractability factor has not. But in the long run, because decommunization is a process, in the long run, what happens that when this new city grows up, for the construction of the new buildings, they wanted material. And where would the material come from? It would come from the banks, the two banks that we have. The Ganges produce the fine quality silt for brick making. So that area, that river bank, was then given on contract to people to make bricks for the building construction. And the Son River bank had thick quality sand, the golden sand, which was used again for the building material. Now, these two developments in the later part of the 19th century actually brings in the subtractability factor now. So the subtractability factor has come late. The excludability factor has come earlier. The subtractability factor has come late in this process of decommunization. Now, obviously, there is an ecological challenge to all these, the long-term decommunization that has taken place. And one of the ecological challenge was that when you create embankment in such a fluvial landscape, what happens is that there is a siltation that takes place. A lot of silt gets deposited when you create an embankment. It's a fluvial landscape where earlier the river would enter into those areas, use those common landscapes, but now you've stopped those rivers to enter into those landscapes, and then the silt gets deposited. In the long run, what has happened that this same river, this massive Ganges river, has shifted more than 10 kilometers away from the city. So these are the long-term implications of the decommonization process in ecological terms. Now, this is all about my story. We can talk more about it when we have some questions coming from you, or maybe some good, interesting comments. Thank you. But any questions? I'd love to hear a few more questions, some interesting comments, so that I can, develop further on this.
And one interesting aspect is the sequence in which excludability and subtractability takes place. So, and the historical analysis is something that could enable that, sequence building, so, which is important. So, just an observation; it's not a question. But if you could reflect on the methodological aspect of, how do we understand that sequence in which excludability and subtractability take place? The other cases, maybe, subtractability becomes the preeminent, outcome, followed by excludability.
Yeah.
And to my understanding, this has significant implications for how we understand problems.
So that's why, in fact, we were discussing this earlier, in fact, in the last book that you did. And in that also, we realized that there were many cases where, these two dynamics of decommonization process are not fixed one. And in many places, what you will find, as you said, that the subtractability factor would come first, and then would come the excludability factor. And in many cases, both would come together, right? So, I mean, it is important for us. I mean, it's a decommonization. One thing is certain, that decommonization is a process. It's not a fixed thing. It's not a one-off event. It's not an event based, based kind of a idea or concept. And decommonization, even if somebody talks about the recommonization or the new commonization, it is also part of that decommonization process, because this new or recommonization is again not coming with the same common rights. So the rights actually change when you have the new commonization or the recommonization taking place. Rights of the people, the rights of the common people. So that is very important for us. And when we try to understand these different dynamics of decommonization process, that makes a very interesting idea. In fact, for history writing, in environmental history, this is absolutely new concept, because commons were studied by environmental history only in terms of resource depletion, because Garrett Arden was one of the one of the subjects of study for the environmental historians. And I've seen many of the environmental historians talking about his concept of commons only in terms of resource depletion. But contrary to that, this is a concept which tells you that it's not all. The story is not all about resource depletion. There is certain other things which are much more important in historical analysis. And the other important things are these smaller dynamics that take place in the whole process of decommonization.
just trying to find out, it from.
So I was wondering sort of about the bunds or the embankments and how they're sort of fitting into being a commonly held space in their own right versus how they're being a government asset. And if there is things in the historical literature that really make them a place where people cannot traverse, or if there's certain common usages that are granted to the people as long as they don't do certain prohibited activities. So in other words, these new structures that you're saying are creating the decommonization of the riverine landscape, how are they creating new spaces of public transit and interaction, and what is the British government allowing and disallowing in these new spaces?
Yeah. So embankments, it's not a new idea at all for these riverine scapes. There were, we have many literatures from historical time period which talk about, the creation of embankment by common people. People were involved in the construction of these embankments, but then, the difference was that earlier the embankments erected by the common people and the villagers were short embankments, smaller embankments, they were not long embankments. Now, what the new embankments have done with the help of technology, like railway itself is a, creation of the railway track, which is on a higher elevation, is itself an embankment, right? Now, earlier, the embankments were created in such a way that the flood water would seep inside when there is a flood taking place. So it's not very high in elevation. And when there is a flood taking place, the flood water would enter into the agricultural field or the common space, right? So that the flood water also brings in the silt which is useful for agriculture. Now, what you have done with these long embankments, that you have stopped these rivers completely from entering into these flood-prone areas, because you have created an urban space, which is a built space, which is a space where you don't want the flood to enter. Now, that has, obviously, it has helped the new settlements, the urban settlements, but it has disallowed many of the agricultural spaces that were in the surroundings to enter, disallowing the rivers to enter into those areas. And then there are long-term implications for those agricultural fields, because there is salination of those soils if the river water doesn't enter in the long run.